The modern healthcare system runs on an intricate network of data, but when that data becomes redundant, the entire structure can collapse. In medical coding, this kind of structural failure doesn't look like scattered paper. It manifests as severe claim denials and targeted compliance audits. The root cause of these rejections often traces back to a single error, confusing the physical volume of a patient's clinical symptoms with the strict administrative requirements of medical reporting. Imagine a scenario where a physician examines a patient and meticulously documents a specific disease occurring multiple times across different areas of the body. Looking at this diagram, a novice coder's natural instinct is to capture every physically documented instance. They attempt to translate the glowing points on the left into individual data slots on the right, forcing each instance into its own line item on the claim. This approach creates an immediate bottleneck. Forcing identical data points through the system generates administrative bloat, directly triggering automated claim rejections. This highlights the disconnect between clinical volume and coding density. High symptom frequency does not require a corresponding increase in diagnosis codes on your final claim. The governing law for this reporting limit is ICD-10-CM Guideline B.12, the strict rule against diagnosis code duplication. Navigating the exact boundaries of Guideline B.12 is the determining factor between submitting a clean, paid claim and triggering a systemic denial. The baseline axiom of Guideline B.12 applies to any single patient encounter. A specific ICD-10-CM diagnosis code is to be reported exactly one time. The underlying logic here is that the administrative billing system registers the categorical presence of a disease. It does not tally the individual occurrences of that disease. We can test this rule by looking at a condition that affects multiple spatial areas simultaneously, such as 3 distinct skin lesions. In physical reality, the physician has clearly documented the diagnosis existing in 3 distinctly separate places on the patient's body. If a coder translates this spatially, they generate 3 identical alphanumeric code blocks to correspond with those 3 distinct lesions. But when the coder attempts to drag all 3 identical codes onto the final claim, the system rejects the duplicates. Guideline B.12 holds firm. No matter how much spatial variance exists, or how many times the condition flares up during that single encounter, the boundary does not move. You report that specific alphanumeric string exactly once. Spatial variance on the human body alone never justifies identical code duplication on the administrative record. The second stress test involves bilateral conditions, where a disease affects both the left and right sides of the body simultaneously. A common assumption is that because the condition affects a left side and a right side, it automatically requires 2 separate line items on the claim. That assumption ignores a critical dependency: the specific structural availability of the code within the ICD-10-CM index. Some specific bilateral conditions lack a 6th or 7th character extension designed to identify laterality within the indexed. When the index does not provide characters for left or right, the clinical condition collapses into a single, identical code string. Attempting to bypass this limitation by listing the exact same code twice, once to represent the left and once for the right, is a direct compliance violation. The singular reporting rule of Guideline B.12 applies strictly to this scenario. Clinical bilaterality is entirely irrelevant to the administrative billing system if the classification system does not structurally support it. The third stress test arises when entirely different diseases occur simultaneously in the same patient. Consider a physician's chart that lists Diagnosis A and Diagnosis B as separate, distinct problems requiring treatment. This introduces a phenomenon known as classification collisions within the ICD-10 manual. Because ICD-10-CM uses broad categorization for certain related conditions, it can force 2 distinctly different clinical diagnoses to map to the exact same alphanumeric string. This creates a dilemma for the coder, who wants to accurately capture 2 distinct clinical conditions but is faced with identical administrative outputs. Guideline B.12 provides a clear resolution. The final alphanumeric string dictates the reporting rule, not the clinical origins of the disease. Because the resulting codes generated from the indexed are identical, they cannot be duplicated on the claim form. If the final code string matches perfectly, it can only be reported once, regardless of how many unique diseases funneled into that single classification. There is one specific boundary condition where the structure of the reporting changes, permitting multiple line items for the same base condition. To understand this, we have to look past the patient's physical disease and focus directly on the structure of the code itself. Certain ICD-10-CM codes utilize their final characters, specifically the 6th or 7th character extensions. These extensions provide specific laterality, allowing the coder to choose between right, left, or bilateral occurrences within the code string. When these specific characters are applied, the administrative output changes. The resulting code strings are no longer identical to one another. Because the alphanumeric characters differ, reporting a code ending in 1 alongside a code ending in 2 bypasses the duplication rule entirely. This structural feature allows you to assign different codes to represent the exact same underlying condition when it appears on both the left and right sides. Structural variance within the final code string is the only valid bypass for the singular reporting rule. In this scenario, you are no longer duplicating data. You are providing two distinct specifications. We can summarize the overarching logic of guideline B.12 into a highly effective tool for everyday coding. At AMCI, we anchor this logic with an MJ-GEM memory concept: one code, one time. To apply this, you need a reliable mental checklist to run during every complex patient encounter. Looking at this flowchart, the first question you must ask is, am I looking at an identical alphanumeric code? If yes, immediately follow up with a test for the exception. Does the index provide a distinct laterality character for this condition? You must constantly interrogate the data to see if you are duplicating line items unnecessarily merely because of a high clinical frequency. The algorithmic output is absolute. Unless that specific laterality exception is met, the outcome is always consolidation to a single line item. Operating under this algorithmic mindset ensures clean data transfer, eradicating the exact redundancies that trigger systemic claim denials.